Fellas, the UFC lightweight division right now is an absolute mess. The lightweight division has always historically been one of the best divisions in the UFC, from the rivalries, to the champions, to the super fights, to the back and forth scraps, to the lineage of champions that we've had in the lightweight division. But right now, the lightweight division is probably at its worst it's been in a while. It's in an absolute mess. We've only got one fight booked in the division, and it's Paddy Pimblett versus Michael Chandler. The rest of the division has no fights booked. And even if you look at the title picture specifically, you've got Islam Makhachev, and if you just do a little bit of a breakdown of his title picture, it's kind of been a bit unfair for him, because he ends up facing against Volkanovski in a fight of the year contender, has a massive back and forth fight with Volkanovski when Volk was in his prime as a champion, beats Volkanovski, and then the excuse is that it was a robbery. Then he ends up, he was supposed to fight Charles Oliveira in a rematch. Oliveira pulls out a couple of weeks before. In comes in Volkanovski on, I think, 2 weeks notice, 10 days, whatever it was. Goes out there and knocks out Alexander Volkanovski, the first guy to knock him out in the UFC. Then the excuse is that he's had a title run full of featherweights and he needs to go out and beat a lightweight. He then gets scheduled to fight Dustin Poirier, has another fight of the year contender for 2024 against Dustin Poirier in an absolute scrap, submits Dustin Poirier to finish it all off. Then the excuse is that it was an easy stylistic matchup, and then he finally gets a matchup that's actually kind of stylistically tough. Arman Tsarukyan, this great wrestler, #1 contender. Tsarukyan just has to pull out on weigh-in day, so Renato Moicano is the only guy that can step in. He makes easy work of Renato Moicano, submits him very easily in the first round, and then the excuse is that it does nothing for his legacy. So Makhachev stuck in this tough spot where he's not really been able to have a respectable title run from most fans. And there's no #1 contender for him as of right now. If you look at the 4 guys at the top of the division who most people would say are next for a title shot, none of them deserve a title shot, and none of them are booked. If you start off with Charles Oliveira, he's obviously a former champion, which is something you've got to take into account. He's faced Makhachev before, and he got dominated by Makhachev before. It wasn't even close. He got dominated in the grappling. He was getting beaten on the feet, and then eventually he got dropped and submitted by Islam Makhachev in that second round. And it wasn't even that close of a fight. He didn't like he put up a fight. He got dominated by Makhachev. And since that fight, he's had a win over currently #9 ranked Beneil Dariush. I know Dariush was like #5, whatever he was at the time, but current #9 Dariush loses to Arman Tsarukyan at UFC 300 and recently picked up a decision win over #7 Michael Chandler at UFC 309. I still think he needs one more win before he faces Islam Makhachev. I know he's got a lot of hype around him. Everybody wants to see Oliveira become a champion, whatever it is, but he still needs one more big win, in my opinion, to really deserve a fight with Makhachev. I mean, he lost last year to Arman Tsarukyan, who we got to get onto now, which is the next contender. You've got Arman Tsarukyan, who I also think doesn't deserve a title shot. Now, he's probably done the best in terms of actually deserving a title shot, I guess, because he went out there and beat Ismagulov, who was ranked #12. He beat, Joaquim Silva. He then goes out there and knocks out Dariush and beats Charles Oliveira. So from a resume perspective, he's definitely the most deserving, but obviously he got his fight with Makhachev, pulled out last minute, and Dana White and the UFC decided that's not, a respectable thing. We're going to cut you. Well, we're not going to cut you from the UFC, but we're going to stop you from getting the next big title fight. You're going to have to wait even longer. So now we're in a position where Tsarukyan's probably going to have to wait even longer to get a title shot, and he probably needs one more win. Which brings us on to Ilia Topuria, which is probably one of the most talked about lightweight contenders right now. Now, obviously, Topuria was a featherweight champion, knocked out Alexander Volkanovski in massively impressive fashion, did the same thing, cracked the chin of Max Holloway, became one of the biggest stars in the sport, and he still needed more defenses before getting that kind of double champ fight with Islam Makhachev. And then he decides, you know what, fuck it, I've got a cheat code. I'm just going to vacate the belt, get rid of the featherweight division, go up to lightweight as another contender. But now he's still got 0 ranked wins in the lightweight division. People would argue that he still needs a win against some lightweight, and I know he beat Holloway, but that was in the featherweight division. And Islam's happily said that if he will fight Topuria, if Topuria fights a contender. But now Topuria's doubling down and saying that he won't fight any contender, and if he is going to fight a lightweight, it's going to be for a belt. So now we're in a position where Topuria refuses to fight a contender, Makhachev refuses to fight Topuria unless he fights a contender, and I still think that Topuria does need a top 5 win in the lightweight division. And then we've got Justin Gaethje, who I feel like he's getting talked about way too much in the title picture. If you just look at Gaethje's past title fights, he got submitted by Khabib, submitted by Charles Oliveira, and I don't think it'd be massively different this time around. I mean, if you look at his last 5 fights, he loses his second title shot against Oliveira, getting chalked out, beats Rafael Fiziev by decision, knocks out Dustin Poirier, which in my opinion would have been the best time for him to get a title shot. Then he gets dominated and knocked out by Max Holloway at UFC 300, and in his most recent fight, he beat Rafael Fiziev by decision, a guy that he's beaten before. So when you really take into account Justin Gaethje, he's on a 1-fight winning streak against a guy that he's already beaten before in a rematch, who was stepping in on short notice, which, I mean, it's impressive, but it's not like a career-changing win. He got brutally knocked out 2 fights ago in a fight that he was getting absolutely dominated by, and he's already 0-2 in title fights while we've got hungry contenders that have never fought for the belt before. Dana White has gone out there and said after UFC 313 that it looks like Gaethje is going to be the #1 contender, and that's led to a lot of backlash online, which rightfully so should be the case, because Gaethje shouldn't be anywhere near a belt at this moment in time. And let's be honest, bring up statistics, bring up whatever you want. Gaethje versus Makhachev. As fun as it might look on paper, this isn't a competitive fight. Gaethje got taken down in the first round pretty comfortably by Rafael Fiziev. Islam Makhachev, who's the best wrestler in this division and probably the best submission artist in this division, I feel like will take down Justin Gaethje and within a couple of minutes find the submission on Justin Gaethje, just like Oliveira did, just like Khabib did. So I still think Gaethje needs one, maybe even two more wins before he faces Makhachev. Gaethje should even be near the title talks as of right now. So no one really deserves a title shot right now. At 155, we're in a really tough position. And then if you go on who has the best chance of beating Islam Makhachev, I would say it's probably Arman Tsarukyan, followed up by Topuria, Oliveira, Dustin Poirier, Justin Gaethje, and Max Holloway, then maybe Dan Hooker if we're really ranking them based on who has the best opportunity. If you're going to throw JDM in a double champ fight, he'd probably be between Topuria and Arman Tsarukyan. So in my opinion, the likes of Poirier, Gaethje, Holloway, and Hooker shouldn't even be near title talks. I know some of them obviously aren't, like Poirier, who's just fought Makhachev, but it should really only be Tsarukyan, Topuria, Oliveira, and maybe JDM in a double champ matchup that should be mentioned when it comes to title talks. What I think the UFC are going to do, which is, going to be quite shameful, is they're going to end up booking Makhachev versus Gaethje. They kind of already hinted at that, or Dana White hinted at that after UFC 313, which is going to be a bad fight because Makhachev's going to beat Gaethje, and it's going to have absolutely no meaning for his resume. If he beats Justin Gaethje, well done, you've beaten a fan favourite, you've beaten a big name, but it does absolutely nothing for Islam's resume, like a lot of his most recent fights have. What the title run is, it's going to end up being Gaethje, Poirier, Volkanovski twice, which I guess the first one was impressive, and Renato Moicano, which for the pound for pound #1 guy in the world, and I'm not blaming Makhachev at all for this, I'm blaming the UFC, isn't the best title run that he could have had. You've got a mare winning Justin Gaethje, a mare winning Dustin Poirier, a featherweight in Alexander Volkanovski, and a free winning Moicano. What it could have been Volkanovski the first time around, maybe in the rematch on short notice, Arman Tsarukyan, Dustin Poirier, and Ilia Topuria. At least the Volkanovski in the first fight was prime Volk. Tsarukyan's the real #1 contender, toughest fight. Poirier, I guess, is a bit of a mare win, but then if he beats Ilia Topuria, that's a massive legacy win. This unstoppable guy in the featherweight division moving up to the lightweight division. So that's the issue, man. None of them are booked as well. It isn't even like we're getting a #1 contender fight. Absolutely none of them are booked right now. They haven't done Oliveira versus Tsarukyan, or Oliveira versus Topuria, or Tsarukyan versus Topuria. None of these guys are booked in #1 contender fights, which is worrying, considering that Makhachev's just fought and it looks like he's not going to be fighting again for a while unless they force the Gaethje fight. So now Makhachev's in a situation where he's fought in January. He can't even fight in June because there's no #1 contender ready for him, which is a massively, shameful thing right now. And then you go to the other contenders. You've got Dan Hooker, Dustin Poirier, and Max Holloway, who are in a really weird spot where they're not a title contender. They've either lost recently to champions or title contenders, and they've not really made it into the top 5. But they're also too good for the rest of the lightweights. I feel like it would be disrespectful to do Dustin Poirier versus like a Paddy Pimblett or, a Michael Chandler part 2. But it was also, it's also questionable putting Poirier back in there with the likes of Tsarukyan and Oliveira, considering, he's coming off a loss and everything like that. So those guys are in a really weird spot. And then you've got the likes of Gamrot and Beneil Dariush. Dariush is washed, has about 1 fight left. Gamrot could not become a top contender. And you can also throw Michael Chandler in that sequence too, between the mid-tier lightweights who are inconsistent and inactive. And you can even throw in Renato Moicano. I know he's not necessarily inactive, but he's also in a weird position where there's not really an obvious fight for him. Does he fight up? Does he fight down? You know what I mean? So Renato Moicano's in a tough spot too. So the lightweight division, even outside of the title picture, is in a bit of a tricky spot. And then you go to the lightweight veterans, the likes of Gaethje, Poirier, and Holloway, who, like I said before, they're just not good enough to become a champion. They're not beating Makhachev, but they won't let anybody else in. Every time they face a prospect in up and coming, they end up beating them, but then they always fall at the final hurdle, which is winning the belt. And they're just gatekeeping the top 5 from any fresh names in the division. We have got prospects in this division: Mauricio Hufi, Yoel Alvarez, Fares Ziam, Ignacio Bahamondes. We've got contenders and we've got prospects in this division, but it's too early to class them as contenders. It's going to be like another year or at least a couple of months before these guys even make it close to the top 5, if they do. So you really look at the lightweight division, there's no fresh contenders for Islam Makhachev. I know you've got Tsarukyan, but like I said, with that situation before, Dana White looks like he's not going to be giving Tsarukyan the next title shot, so he's in a bit of an awkward position. You go to the featherweight division, you've got multiple contenders: Lopez, Evloev, even Laurent Murphy on the rise, and that's not even to mention the new addition of Rafael Fiziev moving down and Patricio Pitbull coming over to the UFC. You go to the welterweight division, you've got Shavkat, JDM, Brady, Buckley. You've got so many fresh contenders on the come up. You go to the middleweight division, you've got Imavov, Chimaev, Baralo, Hernandez. Every division has so many new names and fresh contenders. Lightweight, because there's so many gatekeepers in this division, there's no fresh contenders, there's no new blood who have made it into the top 10 of the division. I know we've got Paddy Pimblett, but I mean, are we all really going to be talking about Paddy Pimblett in a serious serious way when it comes to the title picture. I don't think we are. What I think the UFC should do personally when it comes to matchmaking and when it comes to the top fights in the lightweight division, if they have to get Makhachev booked for UFC 317, Makhachev versus Topuria would be my personal option that I would do for Islam Makhachev. First of all, I think it's the biggest, most intriguing fight the UFC can make. Everybody's calling for this fight. Even though he might not have really deserved it as Ilia Topuria, and it would be good to see him face a lightweight contender, it's still a massively intriguing fight. Two guys who are completely unstoppable going at it. It is a super fight, and I'd say Topuria is the most exciting contender, not only because of his style, but also because of how dominant he is. He's just dominated and knocked out Max Holloway. Well, maybe not dominated Holloway, but he knocked out Max Holloway and knocked out Alexander Volkanovski back-to-back, as well as all the other victims at featherweight. So he's a complete dominant wreck. He's the most exciting contender, and it saves Islam from waiting all year for a title fight and potentially saves International Fight Week. If they are planning on having Makhachev versus Topuria in International Fight Week, I don't think there's going to be much people complaining about that fight. It feeds generation. So I feel like out of all the contenders, Topuria makes the most sense. Tsarukyan, he just fell short at the weigh-in, so it would be unfair to give him another shot immediately. Oliveira's still got work to do. Gaethje, get him out the sequence. And then for Tsarukyan versus Oliveira Part 2. It makes a lot of sense. They're both one fight away from a title fight, so the winner of this fight can go and get a title shot. I think that makes a lot of sense. The first fight was razor close. They obviously fought last year at UFC 300. I thought Tsarukyan was the rightful winner, but there was an argument to make that Oliveira won, so it wasn't like he got dominated like he did in the Makhachev fight. And it's just an exciting high-level fight. You can't complain about Tsarukyan versus Oliveira. If this was 5 rounds, a #1 contender fight, it's not a fight that people have to kind of get over and done with. People are going to look forward to the fight itself rather than just the fact that it's a #1 contender fight. So Tsarukyan and Oliveira is another matchup. But then for the rest of the division, I think you should do Dustin Poirier versus Gaethje 3. I get it, we're kind of being repetitive with these matchups, but if we're really making sense, hear me out. You can also then do Dan Hooker versus Max Holloway, which is an absolute scrap. And you're also giving Dan Hooker a similar matchup to the Gaethje fight. And maybe you do like an ultimate #1 contender where the winner of Poirier and Gaethje faces the winner of Max Holloway and Dan Hooker, unless it's obviously Gaethje versus Hooker 2, Gaethje versus Holloway 2, which nobody wants to see. So if this was to happen, what really could happen for Makhachev is he could end up fighting Ilia Topuria in June, maybe beats Ilia Topuria in a massive fight, and then towards the end of the year in like December time, he could end up fighting the winner of Oliveira and Tsarukyan, assuming that that fight's been made. Or if JDM beats Bilal, I think JDM's another option for him to get double champ status. And then Islam's potentially 2025 could be Moicano, Topuria, and the winner of Tsarukyan and Oliveira, or potentially even JDM, which is a pretty solid year in my opinion. So I think this #1 contender thing between the winner of Poirier, Gaethje, Holloway, and Dan Hooker makes sense. Like I said before, even if Justin Gaethje beats Poirier in a trilogy, I'd say there's still more work to do to earn a title fight because of the fact that we've got like a logjam of guys at the top who are like a fight away from getting a title shot but haven't yet earned it. So I feel like Gaethje has to beat maybe 2 more guys, at least 1 more win, at least in my opinion, to really get that big fight. And then for the rest of the top 15, you do, Gamrot versus Grant Dawson. Fun grappling matchup, makes sense. Gamrot fighting down, Dawson fighting up. You do Mauricio Houfi versus Beneil Dariush. Houfi called Beneil Dariush out. It makes sense. Nobody's complaining. Good fight. Gets Houfi in the top 10. You do Renato Moicano fighting down because he's coming off a loss to Fares Ziam. Fun clash of styles, gives Ziam a top 15 chance, winnable fight for both, I like that. You then do Ignacio Bahamondes against the loser of Chandler and Pimlet. It's a winnable fight for Bahamondes against a big name in the lightweight division. Perry Pimlet's a big name, Michael Chandler's a big name, so the loser fights Ignacio Bahamondes. And then for Yoel Alvarez, you do him versus Benoit Saint-Denis. BSD needs to fight outside the rankings. He's one of the most undeserving ranked fighters in the UFC, and it gets Yoel Alvarez in the top 15. And if you really look at all these matchups, there's like a new up-and-coming guy in every single one of these matchups, and this is where we're starting to see the beginning of the new lightweight era. We're getting these new guys. We're getting this fresh blood in. So, an overall summary of what the UFC should do. Islam versus Topuria for UFC 317. Super fight. Sells a shit to the pay-per-views. The build-up will be insane. And it is genuinely 2 of the pound-for-pound best that we've seen in a while. I think it'll be similar to the first Alexander Volkanovski fight in terms of hype. And I think Topuria's probably got one of the best chances of beating Makhachev in the UFC. So, even though we can sit here and statistically say he hasn't deserved it because he hasn't beaten a lightweight, I don't think anyone's going to complain about that fight. 2, book the top contenders against each other. I'm not really too bothered about the matchups at the top. I would like to see Oliveira versus Tsarukyan, but just put the likes of Gaethje, Hooker, Holloway, Poirier, mix and match them against each other. I get it can be quite repetitive, but the fights always deliver. They're always fun fights, and you can maybe get a top contender out of it for Makhachev to face in maybe early 2026. So, book the top contenders against each other. And 3, get fresh blood in the top 10. Do we really want Poirier, Holloway, and Gaethje sitting in the top 5 die for the rest of the lightweight, you know, the lightweight division's legacy, essentially. No, we want new, fresh blood. I want to see the likes of Mauricio Hufi. I want to see the likes of Fares Ziam. I want to see the likes of Yoel Alvarez. I want to see fresh blood in the top 10. We need new guys to be potentially challenging Makhachev for the belt in the next couple of years. I don't want the same guys at the top. Every other division has new contenders. Lightweight doesn't. So we need to get as much of these new guys in the top 10 to give ourselves the best opportunity of a new contender. And as a result, the title picture saved. Makhachev's got some decent matchups. There's a fun contender fight that can continue between the likes of, like I said before, Holloway, Gaethje, Hooker, and Poirier. And there's fresh blood into the division, which can potentially make for some new, exciting contenders. Get rid of the old guards at the top of the division and potentially some new title challenges. So I think the lightweight division is in an absolute mess, and that is exactly what I would do if I was the UFC, if I was Dana White, to sort out and fix the lightweight division. Let me know if you agree with what I just did to the lightweight division, if you would have any other methods of kind of saving it, but just let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.